So the first step to managing the database availability group is to deploy the Exchange database agent software on the member nodes in the DAG, the mailbox role servers specifically. We've already done that here. You can see CB Exchange 01, CB Exchange 02, both have our Exchange database agent deployed on them, but we're not going to configure any policies here. Instead, we're going to go ahead and create the DAG client object and then start managing the databases in the DAG from there. And to create the DAG, we simply right-click on Client Computers, choose New Client, Application, Exchange DAG. From here, we go ahead and select the domain we want to discover the database availability group in. Click Discover. And you can see it detected the two nodes in my database availability group that have the mailbox role server and have the Exchange database agent software deployed. I'll go ahead and select these here. And before I click OK, just go over a couple other options here. You can see we can use a proxy server for DAG discovery. If you have a need to identify a specific server for all your DAG queries, you can do that here. You also see we have a client name. Now CBDAG01 is the default client name because that's the actual name of the DAG. However, this is logical, so we can call this anything we want, but we'll leave it as default and click OK. Once the screen refreshes, you'll see we'll have our CBDAG01 client object, and we'll be able to manage all the databases in the DAG from this particular client object. But before we get into policies, let's take a look at some of the options here. I'm going to right-click, select Properties, and more pertinent options are down here under the Advanced tab. And the first thing to note here is Enable IntelliSnap. If you want to be able to perform hardware-based snapshots for backup, you've got to click this box. Let's take a look at member servers. If you had new database servers coming into the database availability group, you can click Update, discover the new servers, and go ahead and add them to the group here. Now let's go ahead and click OK. One other piece of software that needs to be deployed to support IntelliSnap is the Media Agent software. You can see here, if I look under Storage Resources and Media Agents, that CB Exchange 01 and 02 both have our Media Agent software deployed. To do any work with snapshots, whether you're the client or a proxy, you have to have the Media Agent software deployed. So we've got our DAG client created, we've got our software deployed, Exchange database as well as Media Agents. We've enabled IntelliSnap on the client properties. Let's go ahead and create a backup policy. Now, like all agents, we have a default policy that will attempt to discover all databases and protect them with default options. However, as a best practice, let's go ahead and create a user-defined subclient. I'm going to right-click All Tasks and say New Subclient. Now, first thing we want to do is give this subclient a descriptive name, and I'm going to call it the database I'm going to target, which is MDB1. And then let's move over to our content screen. Here's where I can discover the databases that I want to add into this policy. Click Discover. It's going to run out and discover all the databases in the database availability group and return them here. And there they are. I'm just going to target MDB1 for now. Let's go ahead and select the subclient. It shows my subclient name, MDB1, and click OK. It's letting me know that there's some other databases that aren't yet configured. I'm just going to say yes to continue here. That's fine. The next tab we want to look at here is Server Selection. Server Selection tab is going to define how we do the backup. You can see the default options here are automatic selection and backup from passive copy. So when this backup runs, it's going to query the DAG, find which node has the passive copy for this database, the database listed here in the contents, and then run the backup on that passive copy. You can see there's some other options here, as well as, or such as backup from the active copy if no passive copy is available, sort of a failover for the backup. And also use the last activation preference to select the passive copy. Go to the furthest activation preference copy to do the backup. If you deselect backup from passive, obviously we will go to the active copy to run the backup. And if none of these options really work for you, you can always use manual server selection. Go ahead and choose Discover and pick the server you want this database backup to always run on. So regardless of whether it's active or passive, we're just going to say this database always runs on this particular node. So here I'm just going to go ahead and leave the defaults and say auto selection, backup from passive copy. And now let's take a look at the IntelliSnap Operations tab. So the first thing to do here is to enable IntelliSnap. And if you had done any prior backups before changing this option, letting you know the next backup will be converted to full, click OK to that warning, and select the array type that you're working with. And in this case, I will be working with a NetApp array, and I've already gone ahead and registered that array with the console. And you can click this Manage Array button. You can see I've got the array added in here, so we can go ahead and work with it. And that's this array management button up top here. So when the snapshot occurs, we're going to talk to the host server, the Exchange server, talk to the Exchange VSS writers, create the database, and then perform the snapshot, and any consistency checking if you've got that enabled. And all of this will happen on the source or production Exchange host. A really nice option for offloading that work from your production server onto a non-Exchange server would be to use these proxy options. So when you select Use Proxy, you'll be able to see any system that has the mediating software deployed on it. And you can select a system to perform any post-backup type operations such as consistency checking or backing up the snapshots off the SAN to disk or tape or what have you. This proxy server does have to have Exchange System Management tools and obviously access to mount the volumes from the array to do the work. If you want to use a separate proxy for your backup copy, that option's here as well. And if you want to default back to the source, if there's a problem with your proxy server, you can select this option here. So really good options for offloading as much of the workload as we can from the production system. So I'm not going to be using a proxy in this case, so I'll disable these and move on to the storage device tab. Here's where we're going to define which storage policy we're going to use. I've already got a storage policy created called Storage Policy 1, and that storage policy has a snapshot copy created, which would be required for performing snapshot type backups. And I've got some other data transfer options here, such as deduplication and so on, which will really only apply not to the snapshot, of course, but to any backup copy of the snapshot. And we're ready to go here. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And we're ready to create a schedule, either automatically associated with a scheduled policy, or I'm going to say do not schedule. And here's our subclient here, MDB1. We can double click, take a look at any of the options if we want to review or make any changes. I'm going to just go ahead and click OK here. And since we haven't created a backup schedule, I'm going to run one manually. Right click and choose backup. We'll take a look at some of these options. First, backup type, full, or pre-selected backup type. And we all know what full is, but pre-selected backup type actually refers to the options selected here at the agent level property screen. Backup type, incremental or differential. Incremental's default will almost always be used. While we're here, we can take a look at this option here, copy backup. A copy-only backup essentially allows you to create a full application-consistent backup of the database and log files without doing any log truncation. In most cases, you're going to want log truncation, and this is off by default. That's what that feature does. We go ahead and click Cancel and run our backup again. But first, let's take a look at the Advanced tab. And most notably here, you'll see there is a Perform Consistency Check option. This is on by default, and this will perform a consistency check against the database and the logs. And if you've got a proxy selected, it'll use the proxy host for that work. And this is not a trivial task. It's very I/O, CPU and disk I/O intensive operation. You can see we've got some throttling options. If it's creating too much load on your server, you can deselect it if you choose. You can also see we've got an option here to create a backup copy immediately. So the snapshot itself obviously resides up on the array. And if you want to be able to back up the snapshots, you can do so as a secondary operation, and you can actually cause that to happen as soon as the backup's done here, if that's what you're after. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect both of these options, click OK, and then click OK to start the backup immediately. And with that running, we'll move over to our job controller, see our job started. We'll see how things move forward. So with our job running, of course, you can double click to get more information about the job details, any events that have occurred, and so on. But we'll let this job go ahead and finish out. Quick note about troubleshooting. Remember where you're running the backup from, if it's the active copy, passive copy. If you're having any issues, go to the node hosting that copy where the backup's running. Take a look at the Windows application log first. If there's any problems with the Exchange environment, you'll find it there right away. And then secondly, you can take a look at the Simpana log files directory, take a look at the latest logs being updated to find any errors there. So we'll let this job complete, and then we'll take a look at a few recovery options. So before I go and look at recovery options, I'm just going to go in here and create another subclient for my databases that are not sitting on the SAN. Let's say a new subclient. We'll call this local DBs, contents, configure, discover. And grab these other two databases, default databases that were created when I installed Exchange Server. There they are. Go ahead and add both of these to local DBs. Okay. So now server selection, I'll leave it defaults again. No IntelliSnap operations. I do need to select my storage policy, and then I can click OK. One quick option here we didn't talk about, maximum node utilization for backup. What this option describes is how many nodes do we want to use concurrently during backup. Now in my contents, I've selected two databases here, and I happen to know that these two databases are both running on independent systems. One's on Exchange 01, one's on Exchange 02. So if I select maximum node utilization for backup 1, I'll only be able to back up one stream at a time. But if I select 2, it'll actually go and run the backup on both nodes simultaneously. So let's select that. We'll hit OK here. Again, I'm not going to schedule right now, and I'm going to go ahead and run this job. As for my first job, I can go ahead and run an incremental. An incremental, of course, will run a transaction log backup for that client. And even though it's Snap, you can still do a transaction log backup if you've got logs on a different volume than the database. We'll protect just the log volume. If they're together on the same volume, then when we do the backup copy, we'll only stream back the log files. Alright, with those jobs completed, let's take a look at Browse and Restore. From the DAG client, we're going to right-click, All Tasks, Browse and Restore, and I can select my time range or view latest backup data, and click View Content. And one thing I want to point out here is that you can see that regardless of whether it was a snapshot-enabled backup, a hardware-based snapshot backup, as was the case with MDB1, or a streaming type backup, as was the case with these two other databases that were sitting on the C drive, I'm browsing and restoring the data the same way. By default, if it's a snapshot backup, it's always going to do a streaming type restore. You will have an option to do a hardware-based revert for certain setups where that's available, not always available with all arrays and certain configurations, but hardware revert will be available for snapshot backup. Obviously, for a streaming type backup, it's always going to be a streaming type restore. So let me first take a look at just MDB1. We'll cover all selected, and I'll show you some of these options here. So step 1, of course, is choose the server you want to restore to. Step 2 is what type of restore are we doing? Are we restoring over the same database, or are we going to a different database? If I choose restore to another database, you can see this option becomes available. I can click the ellipsis button, and it'll go out and query that database and show me, or I'm sorry, database server, show me the databases that exist there, and let me choose the one I want to overwrite. So for example, if I had a recovery database created on the system, I'd be able to select it here and restore to it. The other option I have, of course, is to recover out of place to a file system location. Now when I click the ellipsis button, it'll browse the file system. So I can restore anywhere on the file system outside of the Exchange server, so to speak. And a note about the destination client. This list will include any client that has the Exchange database agent installed on it. It does not have to be an Exchange server, but it does have to have the Exchange database agent installed. So if your use case calls for restoring the database to the file system on a non-Exchange host, you can absolutely do that. Just make sure you install your Exchange database agent on that server, select Add a Place Restore, and then choose a location to recover to. Finally, the with or without recovery option refers to log files. By default, we'll restore with recovery, which means put down the database and the log files and roll them together. If you want to leave them separate, post restore, go ahead and choose without recovery. And finally, we'll take a look at the advanced button here. And here's that hardware revert option. If you do have a snapshot enabled backup, you can do a hardware-based revert. This would be by far your fastest way to recover. However, as you'll see here in the warning, selecting revert will overwrite the entire disk back to the point in time you've browsed in the backup here. So all existing data will be lost if you want to continue. So be careful using this option. Make sure it fits your use case. And the last thing we'll take a look at here, specific to snapshot enabled backups, is the ability to work with the snapshots on demand. Let's take a look at our storage policy, and you can see we've got a snap copy. This is what's retaining all our snapshots on the array. And if I right click and choose View Snaps or View List Snaps, I'll get the list of all the snapshots I've created. And I can right click, choose Mount. This operation can take some time, okay. And then also a warning letting me know that any changes I make to the snapshot won't be saved. If I need to make changes and save them, I should make another copy. Click OK, and now I'm able to choose any client that has our mediation software deployed. Browse to a location on that client. Choose a folder. Click OK, and OK, and it'll mount that snapshot up on that client so I can then go ahead and browse through that client and take a look at the snapshot itself. So why don't we go ahead and do that? We navigate over to Exchange O2, and here we are, test drive, snap mount, and you can see here's my volume. You can drill through and access the database and files. Finally, a place to get more information, documentation.commvault.com, D10 documentation. Go ahead and click on Backup and select Microsoft Exchange Database and drill in here for anything you need to know regarding deployment, configuration, and troubleshooting.